Great. Golden morn.
There we go. So thank you all for joining us today. We have one more Dean seminar, second to the last Dean seminar, but it's always nice to have one of our faculty members from Speech, Language, and Hearing. We have Dr. Megan Gross, who's the director of the Bilingual Language Development Lab. She joined UMass in 2018 and teaches courses on evaluation processes with cultural and linguistically diverse populations and language disorders in children. And her work examines the development of bilingual children with a variety of neurodevelopmental conditions. Broadly, she's interested in the relationships among the linguistic, cognitive, social, and environmental factors that contribute to bilingual children's ability to speak and understand both languages. She does a lot of community engaged research and appreciates the opportunity, as I think most of us do, to work with our community members, clinicians, and families. And she's given us a little tidbit about how she's done some marathons in the past. Are you going to be running on Saturday when we're doing the Dash and Dine?
I am terribly out of shape. But
that's okay, I'm walking, so that should be an encouragement to all, that if you haven't signed up, to please go ahead and sign up. And so without further ado, Megan, we are looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the honor of the opportunity to be here and to share some of the work that we've been doing in the Bilingual Language Development Lab. And I'm really grateful that I see many students from the lab here, and this work would not be possible without them. So to get started, I've already had a lovely introduction from the dean, so thank you so much. And I'm going to share just a couple other aspects of my identity that I think are important to consider in terms of my positionality. So I go by Megan. I use she, her pronouns. And we've already mentioned my role in the Department of Speech, Language, and Hearing Sciences and the Bilingual Language Development Lab. In addition to being a researcher and an instructor, I'm also a speech language pathologist. And so I come at this work from a clinical lens. And I would describe myself as a language learning enthusiast, in that I enjoy learning other languages. I have learned to speak Spanish, but I think it's important to acknowledge that I'm a white non-native speaker of Spanish. And also I'm not autistic and I don't have a language disability. And this is very important to keep in mind when thinking about the participants and the families that I work with, because I'm doing research about aspects of identity that I don't necessarily share myself. And so I think it's important to really listen to and learn from the individuals who have direct shared experience with what I'm talking about. And also I strive to be neurodiversity affirming in the way that I look at and talk about autism. That's an evolving journey and I'm still learning as I go, but that's also something that informs my work. So the basic framework that frames what we've been working on in my lab is looking at the intersection between the experiences of multilingual learners and those with disabilities. And so in the literature, this has been discussed as an intersectional gap. So if we think about multilingual learners, those who have disabilities and are also multilingual learners are often excluded from opportunities that their non-disabled peers have access to, such as access to bilingual education. And then within those who have a disability, those who are also multilingual learners may have reduced access to certain supports and advantages because they've been marginalized due to their cultural, ethnic, linguistic identity. And so I think it's really important for research to focus on this intersection between multilingualism and disability to provide more targeted resources and support for families and children. And thinking about the impact, so currently 22% of individuals ages 5 and over in the United States speak a language other than English at home. And so the number of multilingual learners in our country is large and increasing. 15% of public school students receive special education services. In terms of quantifying that intersection, that actually is challenging, which is a problem in and of itself, because disability services are not always broken down by language status. Sometimes it might just be race or ethnicity. But recent estimates have suggested at least 700,000 children who are dually classified as both multilingual learners and having a disability. And so again, the focus of our research is at this intersection. And what we know from a variety of review papers, there have been several studies on experiences of children in bilingual environments who have disabilities, suggesting that children who have a disability can and do become bilingual. And this has been shown over and over again. And yet there still is skepticism that remains, especially among professionals, when providing advice to families. And there's this idea, especially if a child has more limited spoken language skills, that learning 2 languages might just be too much, which really reflects kind of a monolingual standpoint of suggesting that learning only 1 language is the norm and somehow learning more than 1 is unusual, which is actually not the case in the majority of the world. Thinking about the literature on autism and bilingualism in particular, there has been a huge increase in studies in this area over the past 10 years, but there are some key limitations that remain. One is that they tend to focus on comparing monolingual children with autism to bilingual children, and this results in a focus on the societal language, as opposed to recognizing the diversity that exists within bilingual experiences and focusing not only on their learning of the societal language, which is often English, but also their learning of their family's native language. And when studies of autism and bilingualism in particular, there's a tendency to exclude children who are minimally verbal or who are non-speaking. So the research is really only describing a subsection within the broad spectrum that is autism. And just a quick note on language, I will use both person first and identity first language when talking about autism. So autistic person or person with autism, because some of the parents that I've worked with prefer person with autism. And at the same time, many in the autistic community prefer the identity first language. So I'll use both. And so in some of the work that we're doing, we're trying to address some of these gaps by not even having a monolingual comparison group, but instead looking at the experience of bilingualism as it intersects with autism and other disabilities, and looking at variability within that experience. And so what I'm going to do today is talk briefly about 3 ongoing studies in our lab. And then I'll end with some future directions. And I'm very grateful to have a K-23 career development grant that is starting this year. And so I want to show you how the different threads that I'm going to weave in throughout these 3 projects are kind of leading to this next big study. And so I started before I came here to UMass with kind of a foundation and looking at bilingual language development with a focus on children who have developmental language disorder. And through the projects that I'll describe here, there are some threads that I'll be weaving in throughout. So one is the idea of code switching or translanguaging, and the idea of using all of one's linguistic resources for expression and being in environments where all languages are welcome. Another is the idea of incorporating autism, which was not part of my research in the past, but was part of my clinical experiences and is really important to me in my research. Another is community engaged research, and this is something that I'm continuing to learn more about and to strive toward more participatory approaches. And so you'll see that especially in the second project that I'll be talking about. And embracing the use of mixed methods and incorporating qualitative interview data along with quantitative measures. And you'll see that in the second and third studies. And also beginning to work on intervention. My background has been more in assessment practices, but I'm really interested in how we can best promote the development of both languages for children who are receiving speech language intervention. And then finally, incorporating individuals who are from bilingual families and who are non-speaking. So what does bilingualism look like for children who don't necessarily communicate by talking as their main mode of communication? And so what I hope to show you is how we're starting to look at these things and then where they're all going to come together in the next project. So the first study that I'd like to describe, we called Español e Inglés a la vez, talking and listening in 2 languages. And so in this study, we're bringing in the idea of code switching or translanguaging and also beginning to incorporate children with autism into our work looking at bilingual language development and bilingual language use. And I want to acknowledge the students that have especially contributed to this project. And so this project focuses on the idea that bilingual individuals use their two languages in very different ways. So there are some bilinguals who might tend to use one language at home. If I'm talking about Spanish and English, maybe that's the Spanish at home and English at school. So they use their languages in separate contexts. But we can also have individuals that use their languages in the same context, but with different people. So if we imagine a bilingual family here and that little girl with the arrow above her, you could imagine that she might speak Spanish to her grandfather and then turn and say something in English to her little brother. So here she's using both English and Spanish in the same context, but with different people. So when thinking about models of how bilinguals use their languages, this is thought to be one of the more taxing in terms of cognitive control, because you have to be able to access both languages, but to use them appropriately with different people. But we can also imagine a dense code switching or translanguaging context where everyone in the family is bilingual and there's constant switching back and forth between English and Spanish, perhaps even within the same sentence. And so in psycholinguistic models of bilingualism, this is believed to be kind of an open cooperative relationship between the two languages. So rather than one language competing with the other, the bilingual can access both of them and opportunistically choose whichever language elements help them express their message. And so when we think about the idea of translanguaging and using all linguistic resources to kind of frame that in a psycholinguistic sense, it makes me think of this dense code switching context where kind of any language goes. And so thinking about individuals with disabilities who find themselves in bilingual contexts, the goal of this study is to better understand how they navigate different types of bilingual environments and that dense code switching in particular. So thinking about children with developmental language disorder, some key characteristics to keep in mind are that they tend to have difficulty learning, understanding, and using language, but this is not due to another biomedical condition. They have a particular challenge with language. And while this is often things like grammar, it can also affect conversation because they may not understand what other people are saying around them or have difficulty expressing their message. They can also have challenges with executive functions. So that ability to control which language they're using in different settings for a bilingual child with developmental language disorder, perhaps that could be more challenging. And this is an area that we need to learn more about. Also, they can be really skilled in using compensatory strategies like gesture to get their message across, even if they can't come up with how to say it in words at the moment. And so thinking about translanguaging and using kind of all language skills at your disposal in a bilingual setting, you could imagine children using both languages as kind of a compensatory way to express what they want to say. Thinking about children with autism spectrum disorder, we see differences in social communication, highly specific interests, a tendency to benefit from routines, and there can be a wide range of language skills in children on the autism spectrum. And so thinking about a bilingual situation, there's a lot of social processing involved in figuring out which language to use with different people. And so having a better understanding of what that looks like for autistic children is important. Also, just like children with developmental language disorder, children on the autism spectrum also tend to have some difficulties with executive function. And so navigating the two languages in a bilingual environment is, again, something we need to understand better. Also, autistic children often have strengths in pattern finding. And so that could also relate to the way that they navigate bilingual settings. Maybe they tend to look for patterns and have certain heuristics about how they're going to use language. So with this in mind, the goal of this study is to look at different diagnostic groups and how children's language choices in a code switching environment where they're interacting with a bilingual partner compare to the language choices that they make in a single language environment with people who speak only one language. And so the way that we've done this in this study to kind of balance a natural like interaction with some experimental control is something called a scripted confederate dialogue task, where the children interact with a partner on Zoom and they take turns describing pictures to each other. So they're told they're going to play a game with another person and she's going to pop up on the computer. And then what we've manipulated is the language identity of that person. So you're going to meet the different partners now, and the child does 3 different sessions, one with each partner.
Hi, let's play a listening and talking game. My name is Ashley and I only speak English.
Hola, vamos a jugar un juego de escuchar y hablar. Mi nombre es María y solo hablo español.
Hi, my name is Maria. We're going to play a listening and talking game. I only speak Spanish.
Hola, let's play un juego de escuchar y hablar. Me llamo Carmen y hablo los 2 idiomas, español and English.
And so with the first 2 partners, what we're simulating is that single language idea of maybe Spanish at home, English at school. But with Carmen, we have that translanguaging dual language context where she says very explicitly that she speaks both languages and she uses code switching throughout the interactions with the child. And so the way we measured language use in children is through the scripted Confederate dialogue task where each trial has 2 phases. So in the first phase, the child hears their partner describe one of 2 pictures. So the words are just for your benefit. The child is only hearing this. And then they have to click on which picture they think their partner is talking about. And then they see a picture and they're invited by their partner to describe it. And then she has to find that picture on her computer. And so what we're interested in is how the children describe the picture. Do they use English? Do they use Spanish? Do they use some of both? So these would be examples of children who engage in code switching when describing their picture to the bilingual partner. And these partners are actually pre-recorded videos. So every child gets exactly the same input because it's really hard not to be affected by the child when you're the adult in that situation. But the child thinks that it's live. So it's to try to make it a natural interaction where they have motivation to communicate in a way that their partner will understand them. But we have that control of having it be pre-recorded. And this is being conducted over Zoom. So because it's over Zoom, we have children between the ages of 4 and 6, and we're still collecting data. But currently we have 4 children with an autism diagnosis, 11 children with developmental language disorder, and 19 children who are neurotypical. And because it's on Zoom, they can be anywhere. So we have a variety of different states represented, as well as different regional backgrounds in terms of the Spanish-speaking heritage of their family. And this is important to keep in mind because it could have some influence on how they use code switching. And this is a little side project that my doctoral student, Ada, is working on. In terms of home language, most of these families are predominantly Spanish-speaking at home. In terms of school language, and this goes back to the intersectional gap that I mentioned, notice of the 4 autistic children, they're all in English-only school programs, whereas the other groups of children have at least some in bilingual programs or where they have at least some Spanish support. In terms of language skills, kind of consistent with diagnostic groups, the developmental language disorder group has lower morphosyntax skills in Spanish and English compared to their neurotypical peers and autistic peers, though there's a wide range within the autistic group. And then the social responsiveness scale, which is kind of a measure of autism characteristics, is higher in the autistic group. So confirming our diagnostic identities. So now I'm going to pause the recording because I want to show you some videos of children doing the task. And I have permission to show the videos, but not for them to be recorded. And so now, because I don't have my full sample, what I want to show you are just the raw descriptive data and describe some of the patterns that we're seeing so far. So bear with me, this is a little bit of a complex figure, but the main thing you're looking at are colors and how many different colors you're seeing. So this middle line is each bar is a child. And on the left, we have the children in the who have an autism diagnosis. In the middle, we have the children with developmental language disorder. And on the right, we have the neurotypical group. And then in pink is when they respond by describing the picture in Spanish. In blue is when they describe it in English. And in green is when they use both languages when they code switch as they're describing the picture. And this is in the code switching condition, so when they're interacting with Carmen. So my main takeaway from this part of the data is just there are a lot of colors. So children are responding to that condition in a lot of different ways. Some of them are code switching, some of them are preferring to use English, and some of them are preferring to use Spanish. Within each group, children are also ordered by dominance. So in each group on the left-hand side are the more English dominant kids, and on the right-hand side are the more Spanish dominant kids. So there's some influence of their relative proficiency in which language they're using in this any language goes context, especially in the children with developmental language disorder. But for the children, the neurotypical children, even some of the more English dominant kids are using Spanish in this task. So when they have kind of more resources in both languages, there might be some other factors affecting their language choices. If we compare this to the Spanish condition, so we see more pink, which is what you'd expect because they're interacting with a Spanish speaker, but there's a lot of code switching still happening. And I think this may reflect the sociolinguistic reality of the United States, that Spanish speakers within the US often know at least some English as well. And so children are more likely to code switch with a Spanish speaker than they might be with an English speaker, which is what you see here, where it's almost all blue, with the exception of a few kids with developmental language disorder who had particularly low English skills. And so in terms of overall takeaways, what we see is a lot of variability in how they respond to the code switching context. More use of code switching in the code switching context compared to English, but not necessarily compared to Spanish. Again, reflective of how Spanish is often used in the United States. And in terms of diagnostic groups, no overall effective diagnostic group at this stage, but it looks like there may be some complex interactions between diagnostic group and how they respond to the different contexts that may be further modulated by their relative proficiency in the two languages. So that's essentially a three-way interaction. So we need the full data set to really be able to tease apart those different factors. In terms of implications, so thinking about theory, that framework I showed you at the beginning from the adaptive control hypothesis with the single language, dual language, and code switching contexts is really based on proficient bilingual adults. And so one of our goals is to look at, does this framework really apply to children who are still developing language and who may be developing language in the presence of a disability? And so based on our preliminary findings, their ability to control which language they use may relate to both their neurotype, their diagnosis, and also their relative proficiency in the two languages. In terms of an immediate practical implication for clinicians, I think often when we assess bilingual children, we tend to assess them in English and in Spanish. And from the child with developmental language disorder, seeing how fluidly she switched between the two and how comfortable she was in that context, I think it might be important for clinicians to think about having a more translanguaging environment for children during assessment where they know they can use either language, because maybe they can show us skills in that setting that they wouldn't necessarily be able to show if they felt like they had to use only one or the other. And so that's something that with colleagues we're continuing to explore. So now shifting gears a little bit, that was a kind of more traditional psycholinguistic type of study. And what we're doing in this new project is really trying to dive into more community engaged work. So this is a project that was funded by a public service endowment grant from UMass Amherst in collaboration with One Holyoke CDC, which is a nonprofit in Holyoke, and I'll talk more about them in a moment. But I especially want to acknowledge my doctoral student, Ada, shown in this picture here, because she's really been a leading force in this project. And so in this project, we're bringing in the threads of community engaged research, mixed methods, and also starting to think about intervention. So this started during COVID. I was volunteering with One Holyoke, trying to find ways to be useful and figure out what to do, as we all were. And I met Nairobi, who is one of those community organizers that is just everywhere all at once and wanting to do everything that she can for her community. I'm seeing smiles, many of you know her. And so we got to talking as I was volunteering with her organization about some perceived needs that we saw in the community for more support for Spanish-speaking families who have children with disabilities in accessing support resources. A lot of support groups that are out there are in English, or maybe have an interpreter present, but they're really not focused on Spanish-speaking Latina families. And also finding ways to support bilingual development when there's so many societal forces that elevate English. So concern about losing Spanish was like a big concern among families. Also just increased family engagement and empowerment to be involved in decision-making for their child. And for that age group between 3 and 5, also a difficulty accessing learning opportunities for their child if they didn't qualify for programs like Head Start or Square One, not having enough social schooling opportunities for their children. And so we decided to come up with this project called Supporting Families Raising Bilingual Children that has a few different layers. So it's a monthly group that has been meeting since September of 2021. So it's been Zoom, hybrid, in person, all of the above. And the caregivers, the parents, family members have an opportunity to meet each other and also to learn about different topics that they're interested in from presenters in Spanish. And then while the parents have their meeting, then we provide activities for their children that are bilingual and trying to promote language and literacy skills in both languages. So they don't have to worry about childcare, but also to expose their children to these language-rich opportunities by speech language pathologists and students within our department that have skills in supporting their different support needs. And so there's also a goal of training future professionals. So we have graduate students from our program that come and get clinical hours for it. And it's a chance for them to get to work with dual language learners, which they may not necessarily have in all of their practicum experiences. And then we're also collaborating with community organizations. So they're also kind of involved in shaping the direction of the project. So for the caregiver meetings, these were some of the topics that the parents wanted to talk about. And one thing that was interesting is we have a collaborator in Atlanta who has a similar group, and there was a lot of overlap in the topics that the families in her group were interested in. So I think this raises possibilities for future cross-group collaboration in terms of sharing resources. And then during the caregiver meetings, they would have presentations in Spanish. These are examples of some of the resources shared with them. In particular, we had a meeting about self-care and how to care for yourself while caring for children with disabilities and often aging parents as well. And then for the children, we had kind of a set structure to each session. And I think for our autistic children in particular, knowing what to expect each month when they came to the sessions was really beneficial. So these are examples. We always had a bilingual book, and then we would have arts and crafts activities that relate to the topics from the book. And often they enjoyed hiding things and finding things and putting them on things. So we would try to incorporate a lot of movement, but also providing opportunities to, the child would talk about, I'm gonna make my plátano amarillo, and like opportunities to use Spanish as they're working on the activities. And then this was for Hispanic Heritage Month. So they were really proud to color in the flags from the different countries that their families were from. So in terms of preliminary outcomes, these are examples from open-ended responses from the graduate students of what they said they wanted to learn before participating in the experience and what they said they actually learned coming out of it. And we now have analyzed some interviews from the graduate students as well that provided really helpful ideas about ways we could improve the training experience for them. But they've, I think, generally really enjoyed participating, and we've had some grad students that just keep coming back month after month, which is great. In terms of key components for the families, they've appreciated that the topics were based on their own interests and things they said they wanted to learn about and that they've been offered in Spanish. They've also appreciated the chance to connect with other parents, and the structure of the way we've done the children's activities, especially again for parents who have children on the spectrum who are a little hesitant to participate at first. Now they know what to expect, and like if we have a month when we don't meet, they kind of miss it, is what the parents were saying. And especially the use of both Spanish and English with the children has been important to the parents. And we have a couple of families that don't live directly in Holyoke, but have been participating via Zoom or by driving from a nearby town, where there are not as many Spanish speaking families around them. And so it really gives their children a chance to see other kids speak Spanish too. And so that has led us to a new direction that we're exploring. And this is kind of our foray into more single case or more case study intervention research, where one parent liked the activities that we were doing with kids virtually during the parent sessions, and especially noticing that her child was talking more and participating and doing all that in Spanish. And so she said, can we do more of that? Like, are there programs out there? And we didn't know of one specifically, so we decided, well, we'll just start meeting weekly. And so we have this kind of pilot project now with a group of 5 children between the ages of 7 and 11. And these are 2 families that live in places without a lot of Spanish speakers. And the children have different support needs. 2 of them are autistic. One has ADHD and anxiety. And they had common interests in things like drawing and art and science. And they were varying in their language dominance. So some of them preferred English and some of them preferred Spanish, which at first we were concerned about, but it's actually created a really interesting dynamic in terms of providing a necessity for them to use both languages during the sessions. And so what I've been tracking is across the 5 children, we've now done 25 sessions. When they use their less dominant language, at least once during the session. And so the children in blue are English dominant. And so this is when they use Spanish. The children in yellow are Spanish dominant. So this is when they use English. And then the child at the bottom is actually stronger in English, but prefers to speak Spanish during the group. And so this is when he's speaking Spanish. And so you can kind of see a trade-off where at the beginning, the more Spanish dominant kids really weren't speaking English. And our English dominant child 124 was using a lot of Spanish. And now as those other 2 kids have started using more English, the English dominant child is using a little bit less Spanish. And so now we're kind of trying to figure out how can we continue to have kind of motivation to use Spanish during the group, but he does still use Spanish, especially to address particular people within the group. So with me, even if I'm speaking Spanish, he'll just speak to me in English. But then some of the other kids in the group who he knows prefers Spanish, he will switch into Spanish specifically to address them or to try to get their attention. And the kids seem to be enjoying the activities. So I think our task now is to think about how we can be intentional about which languages we're using and even have explicit conversations with the kids about, because one of them said in a survey, what he learned from the group was speaking Spanish. And so it's something he wants. And so how do we continue to have that environment where he feels supported in doing that? And this is just an example of one of our activities. This is our wonderful RA Lysandra, who's a senior this year and very creative in coming up with ideas. So we made volcanoes and sent a list of supplies so that they could each do it in their own home, and then we were all together on Zoom. So in terms of future directions for this project, our goals are to continue our virtual group and find ways to continue to promote maintenance of Spanish and have it be a positive, enjoyable, affirming experience for the children. To think about collaborating with other support groups that work with Spanish-speaking families to share resources, to partner with existing groups in the community. So now we have a new partner, Enlace de Familias, and we're meeting in their space. And that has opened up a lot of additional opportunities to reach other families that didn't know about the group before. And then also thinking about sustainability, using our multiculturalism certificate within our department as a way to promote continued involvement of graduate students in the program. And then the last study I'd like to touch on is a collaboration within this department. Dr. Yukyung Che, my colleague in speech, language, and hearing sciences, and I have been collaborating with a student, recent graduate, Annalise Castillo, to look at augmentative and alternative communication, which are ways that people who don't use speech as their primary mode of communicating can communicate. So that could be gesture, it could be pointing to pictures in a communication book, or it could be a speech generating device on an iPad where they can like push buttons or type to compose sentences. And so what we've been really interested in is, what does this look like for someone who needs more than one language to communicate? Do they have access to all of the languages they need in their environment through their system? Because in this case, they're kind of dependent on their system to be able to express themselves. And so this project, we looked at the United States. We had a sub-project in Spain, but I'm going to focus on the one in the US for right now. And this is looking at intervention, bringing in the idea of being bilingual and non-speaking, and also qualitative approaches, because these were based on qualitative interviews. So that intersectional gap that I mentioned gets even larger when we think about complex communication needs. And I see over and over again, even within the same family, a parent who said, well, with my son, he's in dual language. He speaks Spanish at school, but my daughter is autista, and so she only speaks English. And both children had an autism diagnosis, but the daughter had minimal verbal skills. And so because of that limited verbal ability, they felt like one language would be simpler. And I think that happens frequently, but we don't actually know enough about the bilingual communication skills of non-speaking folks. And I think we need to better understand what they're processing and understanding of their languages, their sense of bilingual identity, and ways that AAC can help them express themselves. So in the literature, we don't really have much data on bilingualism in AAC. We have best practices for working with bilingual children, and we have best practices for working with AAC, and then some kind of guidelines of what that could look like for bilingual users of AAC, but not a lot of research about best practices. So our goals were to understand, what does this actually look like in the real world for clinicians, and what are some of the barriers and facilitators to providing bilingual intervention using AAC. So Annalise interviewed 10 speech language pathologists throughout the United States, and she was especially interested in the linguistic and racial ethnic identity of the clinician and how that related to their relationship with their clients and some of their perspectives. And so we're still in the process of analyzing all of the interview transcripts as a team of 3 with Dr. Che. But these are just a few key quotes, and then I'll highlight some of the takeaways. So I'll give you a moment to look at this one. And some of the key themes that are in here are the idea of being responsive to the cultural and linguistic background of families, using approaches that are based within their daily routine, using modeling and finding ways to build community. And this comes from a white monolingual SLP. So it also shows, even though she doesn't have a shared linguistic and cultural background with her clients, trying to build that sense of community. And there were a lot of discussions about the role of shared language and connection. So the first quote illustrates how having that shared language can really be beneficial in connecting with clients. But then the second 2 quotes also emphasize that just shared language by itself is not enough, because it's also about having shared cultural understanding, and cultural humility is something that even a white monolingual SLP could strive toward, even if they don't speak the language of their client. So yes, shared language is great, but it's not the only thing. So to kind of summarize the key takeaways, there was a pervading belief that emergent bilinguals who use AAC should have access to both languages through their systems. There was maybe, I think, only one SLP that had some doubts about that, and that could be generational as well. And that speaking the client's home language can help with connection, but it's not the only thing. and the importance of really exercising cultural humility, practicing cultural humility, and understanding each family's circumstances when making recommendations. And so now bringing this all back together in terms of where this research is heading. So this grant has a particular focus on autism. So continuing to go in that direction, focusing on the experience of Spanish-speaking families who are raising a child with an autism diagnosis. And the first aim of the grant is to explore the language environment of the families and what their bilingual experiences are actually looking like and how their language choices might have changed after they received their child's autism diagnosis, perhaps related to recommendations they received. And looking at variation in verbal ability. So this study will include children who are non-speaking from families that speak Spanish. And then the second piece is to measure the child's skills, not only looking at what they can say, but using eye tracking to understand how they're processing words and phrases in both Spanish and English, and also looking at some of their social cognitive skills like executive function, perspective taking, theory of mind, and looking at how bilingual experiences might relate to that. So this brings in the threads of looking at code switching and translanguaging. When do they have opportunities to use both languages? Also the idea of looking at variation in speaking modalities. And then the third aim is to interview families and to understand their experiences around making language choices for their family and accessing support services for their child, and what they would like support services to look like. So before suggesting an intervention, having a better understanding of what families' current experiences are and what they might be looking for. And so here we're bringing in mixed methods, and also the idea of working toward an intervention. So taking what we learned from those interviews to both understand the quantitative data that we get about the children and to look forward in terms of how we could plan an intervention in a community setting to support families. So those would be the next steps after the grant. And working with a community advisory board throughout this process. So when I was writing the grant, I talked to 2 parents and a speech language pathologist and a community organizer to kind of get their perspective on the plan and the questions, and then they'll be continued to be involved throughout the process in terms of looking at all of the materials and making recommendations with what we should do with the findings and so on. And so I'm really excited to be embarking on these new research directions. And just to close, what I especially want to emphasize with thinking about mixed methods is really centering lived experiences. So as I was talking about executive function and bilingualism, I don't know if that triggered the bilingual advantages debate that is very well publicized within the literature, and there's a lot of controversy. But this was a recent article by Dr. Gigi Luck that I think really helps reshape that perspective to focusing on the lived experiences of individuals growing up in multilingual environments, and that something shouldn't have to be an advantage to be considered valid. And so rather than trying to frame it as good or bad, let's just understand people's experiences. And so that's kind of the direction that we're trying to go in our lab. And with that, I want to thank the children, parents, and clinicians who participated in our projects, all my wonderful students in the Bilingual Language Development Lab, Nairobi, our community collaborator, and various sources of funding and support, including from SPHHS, for which I'm very grateful. And now I'd be happy to take any questions or comments.
I thought hands were up, but those are clapping hands. They're clapping hands.
Thank you.
That's great. So where are you going to get your participants in the particular study?
For the new project. So that's where I think the group that we have in Holyoke, I think will be helpful in making connections and working through our community advisory board to then help with recruitment. So that's not just coming from me, but from other people in the community. So within our group right now, we have families whose children will be too old by the time I start collecting data to participate, but then they know other families, and there are families with younger children that have started coming to the group. And so their children would be in the appropriate age to participate. So I think that will be kind of our foundational starting point. And then beyond that, working through school districts, different organizations. We have an alum who works at Holyoke Medical Center and is really interested in collaborating. And so I think continuing relationships with my former students that are now out there working with bilingual families will be really helpful.
I had a question come in on Zoom, on the chat. How does a student get involved in this research?
You can email me. My email's right there. But yes, I love working with students, and I'm always happy to chat with students about their interests. And you can do independent studies, a variety of ways to be involved in the lab.
Megan, I'm curious about the autism spectrum disorder and the spectrum piece of it, and how do you address that when you're trying to understand learning of bilingualism or challenges, because kids vary so widely within that diagnosis, and you have only so many participants you can recruit and follow in that study.
Right. So with the Zoom study that I shared with you, that's kind of almost like a pilot, I guess, in looking at children with an autism diagnosis, where we only have 4 for now. And even within that, one of the children uses mostly single words and phrases and had much more limited language, whereas the other 3 had more advanced language skills in both languages. And within those 3 that were more verbal, 2 of them used one language at a time, and 1 used a lot of code switching. So I think, yeah, there are a lot of factors to consider. So that's why with the grant, the goal is to have 60 families so that we can have kind of a range of skills in terms of levels of verbal ability. Even so, I think that is one of the challenges. There's so many variables to be able to meaningfully interpret the data. Yeah. So that may have to occur across multiple studies, kind of zeroing in bit by bit.
Do you sort of see yourself working like with the School of Education? Is there anybody over there who's sort of interested in being involved? Because it seems to me that what you're going to be learning from this has implications then for how K through 12 sort of implements programs.
There was someone from the School of Education that reached out to me, I think, when the publicity about the grant went out. I think that person may be on sabbatical, so I need to see. But yeah, I think it would be great to collaborate with the School of Education, also even within psychology, and thinking about clinical psychologists. Pediatricians, I think, are also really important groups to involve in these conversations. So yeah, I think being able to share the findings in a broad way, and also to get input from people in different roles working with children to understand what their questions are and what their experiences are.
Well, thank you so much. Your research is so interesting. Thank you for a fabulous presentation.
I'll stop the recording then.